seconds there late. It's Chris here with Laura Jorgensen from Tipster Tours, and we're gonna do a live stream from Austin, Texas.
Oh yeah.
Yeah? Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, I'm gonna get out of the way right away and just turn it over to Laura as we wait for a couple of minutes for people to show up, and we'll start at the top of the hour. All right, spin. Boom. Dun, 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 dun.
Hey y'all, welcome to Austin. While we're waiting to get started here, we can take a little walk around the Capitol grounds. Check it out.
How's your day going?
Oh man, it is a beautiful day. It's a little humid here in Austin. This is pretty typical spring weather. A little cloudy, a little sunny. You know, normally right now we would have South by Southwest going on. It's our biggest festival in town, usually. It was virtual this year, like many things. But last year we didn't have one at all, so still an improvement. But for those of you who have been for South by Southwest, or if you haven't been, it usually takes over the whole city right around this time. Oh yeah, you can see I've actually got my tote here from a couple years ago. Now it started back in the 80s as a way to kind of show off our local music scene, get the industry people here. But it was very small. Few bars on 6th Street, all local bands. It's grown to huge proportions since then. Now we typically have thousands of artists from all over the world, all styles of music, who come for South by Southwest, and tons of unofficial shows going on as well. So normally there'd be tens of thousands of performances happening all over town. Hopefully that'll be back to a little more normal next year. So if you have never gotten a chance to come for South by Southwest, it's pretty incredible. You kind of have to see it to believe it. But it's not just about music anymore either. It's about technology, education, film, comedy. There's so many elements to the festival now, even more than I can keep track of. But yeah, let's keep walking around the Capitol grounds here for a minute.
Our start point.
Thanks, Al, for the greetings from Canada. Teague, great to have you joining us here.
Teague's one of our biggest friends and supporters, and is actually a co-host of our Sakura trip to Kyoto tomorrow with Shohei Toyota.
Awesome.
So, thank you, Teague, he had a late night last night. Glad to see him here.
Yeah, thanks for getting up to join us.
If anyone's watching over on YouTube, if you could just say hi as well to let us know that the YouTube channel is working. That's always great. Oh, there it is, Carla Hoover. Excited to see
Austin. That's my mom. Hi, Mom.
Oh, moms. My mom will probably join too.
Great.
She usually watches on YouTube, so they can maybe watch together.
Well, you can see our beautiful Capitol building here. This stone is called Sunset Red Granite. That actually comes from not too far away from here, Central Texas, from a little town called Marble Falls. But it's actually kind of a funny story how we even got the granite to build this Capitol from, because back in the 1880s when it was under construction, well, the stone was pretty expensive. It wasn't really in the budget. But the quarry owners out there were also having some trouble selling their stone because the area was so remote. There wasn't really a great way to get out there. So, you know, they actually offered to donate all the stone to the state on the condition that the state build the railroad out to Marble Falls. So that's exactly what they did. Got all the stone trucked in here. Of course, then the quarry owners had a lot easier time selling their stone to others as well. And the result is this big, grand Capitol building, which we'll talk a little more along the way. This is actually the 3rd Capitol building that Austin has had. But we'll save some of those stories for a minute later.
Here, just to say, Nikki, Ross, appreciate you guys both being on the chat, especially because you guys barely ever see each other. So it's always nice to get some love from Edinburgh.
Matthias, hi.
Matthias, awesome. Reaching out from Fairport, New York, near Rochester. Very cool. Guys, if you're joining the chat right now and you're coming in, please just tell us where you're watching from. Let us know. You know, tell us where you're coming from. Say hi. Don't be shy. In fact, everything that you say, every comment you make, helps us reach more people. So that's really useful to spread the word, especially as we get started and start up the stream today.
Also, feel free to ask all your questions about anything Austin related. And you can see, of course, this is the state capitol, so we've got a demonstration going on here today, seeing the political process in action.
Without the consent of the governed. We are all committed to coordinate all efforts with as much and Congress and all international communities.
Teague mentions that the building is very grand and stunning, almost some Italian flavor, like in Florence.
Ooh, yeah, absolutely. So the architect was a guy named by the name of Elijah Myers, who designed several state capitals around the US. And there was actually a big design competition in the first place because their older capital was not so grand. And in the early 1880s, they were really wanting to replace it. So there was a huge competition. Elijah Myers won with this design. And well, conveniently, immediately thereafter, their old capital actually burnt down. So it kind of sped up the need to construct this big grand building here. But yes, it is pretty majestic. When it was finished in 1888, it was actually the 7th largest building in the entire world. So we do like everything bigger here in Texas. It's also actually just a few feet taller than the National Capitol building. And that is thanks to the Goddess of Liberty, who is up there on top. We'll see if we can get a good view of her here through the trees. Now, she looks pretty from down here, but actually up there, she's not the most beautiful lady. They did have to exaggerate the dimensions and features of her face a lot so that she would look good from down here on the ground. But actually, if you visit the Capitol Visitor Center nearby, when you do come to Austin, you can look through a telescope, look her straight in the face and see, yeah, she's a little intense looking.
Can you guys see this okay right now, how I've zoomed in on it? Let me know in the chat if you can see this goddess of liberty. Does she have a lone star in her hand? Is that what that is?
Oh, yes, she does.
Goddess of Texas liberty, huh?
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually the second statue that has stood up there. This is a replacement that was made in the 1980s, about 100 years after the original was put up. The original, as it turns out, she was not in such great shape by that time at 100 years old, and there was actually a hive of bees living in her head when they took her down. So this one's luckily in better shape, sitting up here on the top of the Capitol.
Thanks, T. Good to know that we can see okay. Thanks, Kristen. Appreciate
Great, thanks,
it.
y'all.
And Michaela. Hey, Michaela. Thanks for coming back again. Michaela's watching from Cologne, Germany right now.
Ooh, yay, great. Actually, let's take it one step closer again real quick. I want to show y'all one other cool thing on the front of the Capitol building here. Now, if anybody has ever been to a Six Flags amusement park, you might have wondered, where did the Six Flags come from? What are the Six Flags? Anybody know the answer to this? Pop it in real quick. But we can see the Six Flags, the amusement park is named for, right here on the front of the Texas Capitol. And that's because they are the Six Flags of the nations that Texas has been a part of, at least since colonizers arrived in the 1500s. So from the left-hand side, Spain, France, Mexico, the Lone Star, the Republic of Texas, the Confederate States, and the United States. Now, Texas was a part of the United States for a while before joining the Confederacy. They became a state in 1845. But you know, we got to put them. Wondered about the Six Flags. Those are them right there. Which one is your favorite? Which country do you think Texas should be a part of? The Lone Star State? And we can see, again, all kinds of ideas, all kinds of movements are represented here at the Capitol. Any old day you might come by and see a protest, a rally. So we're gonna start heading off the grounds here. What time are we at right now?
It's official start time.
All right.
I think that we can definitely build a little bit the audience and ask people about comments and sharing. Of course, that helps to bring more people into the event with us right now. But you can do your welcome to welcome to Austin. And in fact, what we'll do, something secret for all the live streamer watchers right now. We'll actually cut this video later on to officially start after you make your introduction right now. So anyone who watches on YouTube has missed everything. Like if you watch it as a video later on YouTube, you've missed everything until this moment, but you guys who are watching live get extra. So whenever you're ready, let's start it.
Great. Well, welcome to Austin. Welcome to the capital of the Lone Star State. Again, my name is Laura Jorgensen. I'm here with Tipster Tours. We are a tip-based free walking tour company in Austin, the first of our kind here in town, although inspired by those that I've gotten in other cities in the past. Now, if you've ever been on a tip-based tour, or if you haven't, you might wonder, why would we do free tours in the first place? Well, a couple reasons. One being, of course, that we love our city, true local experience of our city, and you know, regardless of what your budget is when you come to Austin or when you join us on the internet, we want to make sure that you really get to see an authentic side of Austin, hear a little bit about its history, present, future, and hopefully, well, enjoy your time here. So that's really what I'm here to do. You know, we've got donation links in the description, so if you do enjoy yourself,
We can't help but look at this.
absolutely, yes, let's go for it. Yes, take a look.
Thank you guys. The world is watching.
Yeah, cool guys. Well, you know, this is one of the reasons why I love starting tours at the Capitol, because you will find all different kinds of people here expressing all different kinds of ideas. So it's really an amazing place to get a sense of how diverse Texas really is. And you know, let's head over this way. This actually opens up a great opportunity to talk a little bit more about the history of Texas and of Austin specifically. I guess I cut my intro a little short there, so hi to everyone who's still just joining us. Again, I'm Laura with Tipster Tours from here in Austin. Now, I'm actually not a born and raised Austinite myself. I am originally from the Seattle area, but I came to Austin for grad school about 8 years ago and completely fell in love with the city and with a local musician as well, who is now my fiance. So great reasons to stay for sure, but it's a pretty common theme these days. Austin is a fast-growing city. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But I hope that y'all will also enjoy visiting us today in the capital of Texas. Now we are headed over here towards the Tejano Memorial, which many of y'all may know. Texas, or Tejas as it was known at the time, was a part of Mexico when they declared independence from Spain in the early 19th century. Now prior to that, of course, it was inhabited as well by a number of indigenous tribes here who were settled right in this area. But the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, the French were not long behind, and of course the United States eventually was vying for power in this area as well. But Tejas, a state of Mexico in the early 19th century, that heritage is still very present here today. And we can see here the Tejano Memorial, recognizing those settlers from Mexico who came into the area at the time. But there were also a lot of Americans coming into the area at the time, and that was partially because, well, Mexico really wanted to kind of speed up the settlement process of the area. So they really liberalized their immigration policies and actually started to recruit Americans to come here as well. Now, they called themselves Texians when they got here. And, you know, there were some tensions between the Tejanos and the Texians at times, one of which was a language barrier, as many Texians didn't speak Spanish and many Tejanos didn't speak English. But there was also another issue, which was that in the 1820s, Mexico was in the process of abolishing slavery. And many of the Americans moving here didn't really want to abide by those rules. So ironically, in 1830, Mexico did actually ban the further immigration of Americans, specifically into Tejas. It's a little funny to consider that part of our history nowadays, given everything that's happened since. But, you know, they kind of ignored the ban. They just kept coming in anyway. And by the mid-1830s, Texians outnumbered Tejanos around here by about 4-1 and decided they didn't want to be a part of Mexico. They wanted their independence, and so they went to war. In 1836, after, well, some major losses like the Battle of the Alamo, and then a really dramatic turnaround, the Texians actually were able to establish their independence, declare themselves as the Republic of Texas, and they remained an independent country for about 10 years until 1845, when they did vote to become a state, mostly because, well, their country wasn't recognized by many other nations, which made their currency essentially worthless for international trade. Now, we can still see the importance of that Spanish and that Mexican heritage reflected here. And we're gonna kind of head out of the grounds here, see a little bit more of downtown.
Did you guys have a favorite statue there? Was there one of them that you liked more than the others? Were you more with the Spanish conquistador up there? Or were you more of a fan of one of them steers that Texas is so famous for?
Those are our longhorns.
Let us know in the chat, guys. Tell us in the chat which ones you like. What statue was your favorite statue there?
You know, I think I'm most affiliated with that young girl just hanging out, waiting to see what the future holds for Texas. Now, we've got a little bit more of a controversial monument here that we're heading towards. Of course, in the last few years across the United States, a lot of Confederate memorials have been taken down. But here on the Texas State grounds, we still have 11 of them up. This one in the most prominent position. And for now, the state does say they intend to leave these up as a way to reflect a certain period and perspective from American history. So let us know what y'all think. I know it's a very controversial topic, but we can see here recognition of the fact that Texas did participate in the Civil War on behalf of the Confederacy, which was actually itself a pretty controversial decision at the time. Now, Sam Houston was a very important political figure in Texan history. He was one of those who led the Texans to victory and independence, was their first president, later governor when they became a state. And as governor, when the Civil War began, he really did not want to get involved. Texas was so far removed from the battlegrounds at the time, he figured they should stay completely out of it. But his lieutenant governor did not agree. He was a big Confederate supporter. And so he actually ousted Sam Houston from power and led the Texans to war. Now, this Confederate monument, like many around the country, was actually installed about 50 years after the war ended by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And whether it should still be here or not is definitely a subject that is often up for debate. So again, let us know what you think. But we've also,
That's not Abraham Lincoln up there.
That is not Abraham Lincoln. A lot of people do ask that question. It does kind of look like him, but no, that is Jefferson Davis, actually.
Ah, okay, the other guy.
Yes. If we head around this way, though, we're going to see our favorite monument here on the grounds. It's a newer addition. And hey to those just joining us. Now, I'm not talking about this volunteer fireman here, although the volunteer fireman did play an especially important role in the city of Austin. And that's because Austin's fire force was actually completely volunteer until 1916. So until that point, you had businessmen, cattle ranchers, all kinds of people volunteering as our fire force. But as we'll hear a couple times along the tour, fire was a pretty big issue in Austin in the late 19th century. And so these firemen were very important to our city.
Where does water come from in Austin? Is it like a river or a natural spring?
Yeah, great question. Well, we've got the Colorado River running through the city. It's not the big Colorado River, actually. It's a smaller Colorado River, misnamed that way by settlers who thought they'd gotten to the Colorado River, but just hadn't quite made it far enough west yet. So yeah, we've got our own Colorado River here in town, and we're part of this incredible aquifer in central Texas that provides our fresh water. But you know, Austin was actually pretty late to the game in getting fire hydrants. So that was definitely one of the main issues for firefighters in the late 19th century. There just wasn't water readily available throughout town for them to fight fires with. But returning to the idea of the diversity of Texas, the importance of the history of its different peoples, and to the Civil War as well. We've got this newer monument here on our grounds. This one's about 5 years old. It's our beautiful African American History Memorial. This was sculpted by a man named Ed Dwight, who really has an amazing story. Back in the 1960s, he was in the Air Force, and he was the first African American who was tapped to train as an astronaut. But he actually did not get to go into space himself. He left the Air Force because of what he saw as racial discrimination that he was facing there, and then went on to develop an amazing career as a sculptor instead. So you'll find pieces of his at lots of state capitals all over the country. And here we can see a long history of African Americans here in Texas.
Is he the sculptor for this memorial?
Yes, he was, yes.
So actually, this astronaut is not just the astronaut, but he's the sculptor.
Well, so this is actually not Ed Dwight himself,
sorry.
because he didn't get to go into space, but he did choose to include, of course, a representation of the first black astronaut who did. As well as you can see on that side of, since we're looking over here, representation of many of the important people who have contributed to Texas culture, to music, to education, to sciences, sports, and some of the important legal cases as well. Now, many of us are familiar with the case of Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated education in the United States. But not as many people are familiar with a case that preceded it and actually set a versus Painter. And Mr. Sweat, he was a student who was interested in studying at UT Law. But when he applied, he was actually declined admission, even though he had an incredible resume, and he was told that he could attend the separate but equal school for black law students in Houston. But he argued in the courts that that law school in Houston was not equal to UT's law school. It didn't have the quality of faculty, didn't have the access to resources, and so argued that that was not truly separate but equal. He won that case, and again, like I mentioned, that set up for success for Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate elementary and high school education as well. But coming over to this side of the sculpture, we again trace our history back much further, all the way back actually to the arrival of Spanish colonizers in the 1500s, who brought the first people in slavery from North Africa with them here. And we can see during the era of slavery that 3 of the main industries of Texas were built. We see here a man passing a bale of cotton over the top of the sculpture. And if we come around the back, we'll see where he's passing it to. So cotton, one of the main industries of Texas, along with cattle and oil, that have really built us into a very prosperous state today. So Ed Dwight was intending to represent, with that passage of the bale of cotton over the top of the sculpture, that it was really that labor provided by people in slavery, that it was their work that really built the foundation that Texas is on and really built the prosperous state that we are today. So that labor is incredibly important, but we also have to recognize, of course, the difficult history behind it and the fact that that labor was not provided willingly. We also have here recognition of the black soldiers who fought for independence for the Republic of Texas in 1836. They took part in many important battles, including some big losses for Texas, like the Battle of Goliad. But unfortunately, we're not really recognized fairly for fighting. In fact, every soldier that fought for independence for Texas was promised that they would receive land, a place to settle once independence was established. And for the black soldiers, that land was really not readily given as it was for the white soldiers. They had to fight in the courts. They also plead for their freedom because in Mexico, as we learned, slavery had already been criminalized, had been made illegal. So when the Republic of Texas was reestablished, it was brought back, and even those who had fought for independence had to go to this new government and get their freedom papers to prove that they really, were able to live freely here, which is one of the reasons why, well, Texas's position in the Civil War was such an interesting one. Being geographically removed from the rest of the country at the time, Many people fleeing from the battleground states in the East came here to Texas during the Civil War, brought even more people here in slavery with them. And by the end of the war, we had about 250,000 people in slavery in Texas, which is why our Emancipation Day of June 19th, 1865, is such an important day that's so widely celebrated here. That was the first day that Union soldiers arrived at the borders of Texas to begin enforcing emancipation. It was almost 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was given. So we were pretty late to the game. There were a lot of people here to emancipate. Hence, its celebration as one of the most important days in our calendar here in town. But we're gonna head off the Capitol grounds now, see a little bit more downtown.
Shannon just joined. Hey Shannon, great to, or maybe not didn't just join, but Shannon just said hi and said so detailed, love it. My question to Shannon is, Shannon, are you talking about Laura's incredible presentation and detailed overview of history, or are you talking about that monument that we just visited? Which one, or both, in fact?
All right, we're gonna head across the street here. But as I mentioned earlier, this Capitol is actually the 3rd Capitol building that Austin has had. When the city was first established in 1839, yeah, thanks Shannon, both the sculptures and the history. You know, the sculpture is, again, like I mentioned, my favorite on the Capitol grounds. I think it's such an incredible representation of such an important part of our history that historically has been fairly overlooked. So I'm glad that we have that here on our Capitol grounds now. But again, 3rd Capitol building that we've had here in town. Now, Austin was established in 1839, a few years after Texas achieved independence. And actually leading up to that point, there had already been a lot of debate about where the Capitol should be. Now, Sam Houston, who I mentioned earlier, one of those who led the Texans to victory and independence, he was their first president. And unsurprisingly, he argued that his namesake city, Houston, should be the capital. And it was the most established city in Texas at the time, so it made sense. But his political rival, Mirabeau Lamar, had a different idea, which is that they should build a bespoke capital city from the ground up. They could make it grand and beautiful. And after camping out here, he actually specifically chose this location himself, on the banks of the Colorado River, with a hill leading up to where the beautiful grand capital would be. But yeah, we are gonna go in here in a minute. But first, their original Capitol building was actually just a big log cabin. 2 rooms, one for the House, one for the Senate, built out of wood. That was it. It was a few blocks away. It doesn't stand any longer. But after becoming a state in 1845, they did build a limestone Capitol building here in Capitol Square. Lasted for about 30 years, but didn't treat them very well. It was kind of an ugly building, actually. One of its main issues was that our local limestone has a lot of traces of iron in it, so it actually rusted and discolored over time. And then in the early 1880s, it burnt right down because our limestone is so porous around here. When you fill it with wooden furniture and set it on fire, it tends to just crumble. So as I mentioned, before we got the tour started, they had actually already decided to replace that ugly old Capitol building, held a big design competition, selected this design by architect Elijah Myers, and they were ready to begin building, but they hadn't yet. So they were in a bit of a bind. The state government needed somewhere to go. And they came here, right across the street actually. And you can see here the ruins of a building, which was very cheaply, shoddily, and quickly thrown up to temporarily house the state government while our big sunset red granite Capitol was under construction. So this building did last long enough to house the state government in that interim period. And then it actually housed Austin High School, business offices, and places for music lessons. But in 1899, guess what? It also burnt right down. And that actually was a big event. A lot of people gathered in the Capitol grounds to watch the destruction of this building. And you know, it actually sounds like it was a pretty exciting day. Would you go watch a fire if a major building in your city was burning down? I don't know. Maybe the culture was a little bit different back then. But I read accounts of high schoolers doing handstands and cartwheels in the Capitol yard as their school burnt, so they seemed pretty excited about it. But actually, we're pretty lucky that we can still see these ruins, that we have this nice little park here today. because actually after the building burnt, it was a park for a little while, and then this area was actually paved over and used as a parking lot. But by the 1970s, historic preservation was starting to become a little bit more of a concern for people in Austin. And this building here was actually slated to be demolished. Now this building is from 1876. It was built by a Swedish immigrant, Charles Lundberg, and he opened a bakery here, which for 60 years was the most popular place for not only the government officials, but all the locals of Austin to buy their delicious bread and pastries. But after the bakery closed down, well, the future of the building was unclear. But fortunately, it was rescued by a team of historical preservationists who also argued that we should tear up the parking lot, excavate this lot, and bring these ruins back to being a park, which I think was a pretty great idea. Just want to get y'all a chance to look at the beautiful front of this building. Then we're actually going to head up the hill here towards the governor's mansion. But just note that this is definitely worth a visit if you do come to Austin. The old bakery now houses a really cool little visitor center with some exhibitions about Austin history, an art gallery with work by local artists, and of course a store where you can take home some of those locally made crafts yourself.
What do these symbols on the wall here mean?
Yeah, great question. So these, as you can see, are from the Texas Historical Commission. So these designate buildings that are historic and preserved here in Austin. Now, again, this is something that we're pretty lucky to have because in the mid-20th century, historical preservation wasn't as popular. In the 1950s and 60s, you know, a lot of people didn't love these old buildings. They were considered old-fashioned. They were really expensive to maintain, and many of them were covered up or torn down. But luckily by the 1970s, the tide was turning, and every historic building remaining left on Congress Avenue in good shape was actually designated a historic site. The street itself from 1st to 11th is designated a historic district. And so luckily these days we have protected these buildings to enjoy for the future. Now we've got a great question from Jack Anderson here on the chat. Now for those of you who don't know, Jack would actually be very good at this job. He is a great radio host here on KUTX, which, if you're not in Austin, you may not know the radio station KUTX. You can listen to it online though from anywhere in the world, and I highly recommend that you do so. Because as you might know, we are the live music capital of the world. We have an incredible, diverse music scene here in Austin, and KUTX is definitely one of the best places to explore that scene from afar. They play a lot of great local music. Jack is actually responsible for the Song of the Day, which always features a new song by an awesome Austin artist. So check out his work on KUTX.
Nice plug. Sterling Stefan also reached out to say, great presentation.
Thank you.
So detailed.
That is my fiance, so he's a little biased, but you know.
Sorry for not having called him out sooner.
Also to shout him out though, the reason I definitely permanently stayed in Austin, and he's a local musician himself, so if you've ever been out to see a show in Austin, there's a pretty good chance that you've seen him play saxophone.
Cool.
But I want to kind of turn slowly here back towards the Capitol, get one more great view as we head up this little hill, and point out one of the buildings that actually started the whole historical preservation debate in the first place. Now here, right outside the west gate of the Capitol grounds, is the Westgate Tower. It was built in the mid-1960s. It was the first mixed-use commercial, retail, office, and residential building in Austin. But its construction was pretty controversial. It was the tallest building, especially so close to the Capitol. Locals were worried that it would block the Capitol views. And a lot of the state government officials thought it would be an eyesore. They fought tooth and nail against it, but in the end couldn't keep it from being built. And funnily enough, after it was finished, several of those same state officials did end up buying condos and moving in.
A couple quick questions coming in if you've got a second.
Yeah.
I'll come close to you so I can get picked up on the mic, or you can just read them off. Teague asking, historical buildings, stunning. What are some good local foods, barbecue, such as that?
Oh, yes.
And where would you go out? And then Ross writes from Edinburgh, how big is Austin when compared to other cities in Texas?
Both great questions.
A couple of things for you to...
Yeah, so good barbecue, just to list off a few. You know, Franklin's is the most famous one. It's good, but if you don't want to wait in line for hours and get there at 8:30 in the morning, like one of my friends did for her birthday party a couple years ago, then there are some other definitely good places that you can check out. Actually, just a few blocks away from Franklin's is another little family-owned truck called Mcconaughey Craft Meats. That's a great place. Out in East Austin, you've got La Barbecue. Down south by Zilker Park, you have Terry Black's Barbecue. And then, of course, if you're willing to do a day trip out of town, that's where you really get good. Lots of places in the hill country and between here and Houston in tiny little towns where you'll find amazing barbecue.
You've been to Salt Lake?
Salt Lake is such a good one. Classic, you know, just outside of day trip to Austin place. And out in that area, you'll also have a lot of distilleries, wineries, breweries, so very easy to make a little day trip, drink, eat, enjoy all that Texas has to offer. And how big is Texas compared to other cities or Austin compared to other cities in Texas? Great question too. We are technically the 4th biggest city in in Texas. Houston is the biggest. Dallas, if you combine it with the Fort Worth area, ends up being 2nd. Then you got San Antonio. So we come in 4th on that list, but we're actually, well, all the cities in Texas are growing pretty quickly. We are the fastest growing though, and we are actually one of the fastest growing cities in the entire United States, have been for over 20 years, but we've especially picked up speed in the last few years. Here they estimate we've got about 170 people moving to Austin on a daily basis now. So while Austin has about doubled in size approximately every 20 years since it was first founded, if we keep up at this rate, we will more than double in the next 20 years or less. But currently we're at a little over 1 million people in the city, 2.5 million in the metro area. But yeah, we are growing really quickly. We'll talk a little bit more about that along the way as well. But while we're here, I want to tell you guys about the beautiful governor's mansion. So this place was finished in 1856. It has hosted every single Texas governor since then. Sam Houston was one of the first to live here, and some say he is still hanging out where we do still have his old bed. Now, sometimes we are so lucky as to see the governor's golden retrievers, Peaches and Pancake, here outside. Not seeing them right now, but you can follow them on Twitter if you want to know what they're up to. It is still the residence of the governor, Greg Abbott, these days. But 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, in 2008, Rick Perry lived here. And at the time, the mansion needed some updates and renovations. And so the Perry family had to move out. All the historic furniture and artwork was put into storage. And that summer, 2008, somebody actually came and threw a Molotov cocktail from all the way out here on the street straight into the front window of the mansion. Started a big fire, part of the roof collapsed. It was a, you know, big disaster. All of a sudden they needed a much bigger renovation budget. People flooded in donations from all over the state to rescue and salvage the building. Luckily they did a pretty good job with that, I would say.
How far would you say that throw is? Oh
gosh, I don't even know. But you know, of course, there are a lot of theories about who might have been responsible because nobody was ever actually arrested for this crime. So one theory that I would say is probably a pretty good one is that it must have been a football player to have an arm like that. And there's actually another reason behind that theory too. They did have some security footage of the person responsible for this, but didn't do much to help them identify him because it was a white man of average height wearing a Texas Longhorns cap. Which the Longhorns are the mascot of our local football team at UT. And, you know, pretty much everybody in town has one of those caps. So, you know, it's still a mystery to this day. Probably always will be at this point. But we're gonna head here towards another really interesting building that has a much lesser known interesting history, actually. It's this cool Art Deco building here on the corner next to the governor's mansion. Now,
Jack Anderson says, by the way, Sosa says hi.
Ah, Sosa. Hi, Sosa. Sosa's one of my favorite cats in the world.
Shannon also shouts out Peaches and Pancakes. I think those are
oh, yes.
great names for dogs.
I totally agree. You know, it's always fun, especially on morning tours. They often are out on the yard. They'll come right out to the gate and say hello to us. I haven't seen them in a while, so I really miss them. But yes, love the dogs, the first dogs of Texas. And yeah, so we've got this really cool building across the street here. Now, not many people know what the history of this building is, because for a long time now it's been a state government office like a lot of the other buildings in this neighborhood. But when it was actually built in 1941, well, there's a good story behind it. So in the late 90s, perhaps, or that's 1890s. Wait, sorry, no, I'm getting confused here. 1930s, we're talking about the 1930s.
Art Deco.
Of course. So in the late 1930s, perhaps the richest man in Texas was a guy named Jim West. He was in lumber and cattle, and he also had a lot of very strong political opinions. Particularly, he was a very outspoken supporter of the very unpopular governor, McDaniel, at that time. And he really wanted to see his political views and his support for the governor better reflected in the media. So he decided to do it himself. So he actually bought a number of radio stations and the remains of a defunct daily publication, which he revived as the Austin Daily Tribune in 1939. Now if we head across the street here, get a closer look. This building, like I said, was finished in 1941, and it was built especially to house these newspaper presses, their offices, and on the top floor, a beautiful penthouse for Mr. West himself. And you can see he actually specifically asked the architect to include these porthole windows down the side, which point towards the Capitol building, so he and his team could keep an eye on the state government at all times. But poor Mr. West actually did not live long enough to see much come of his newspaper. He died that same year of a bad cold, and of course that was right around the time that the United States was entering World War II. So a lot of his reporters in the next year after he died ended up being drafted, and by December 1942, the publication. If you ask most Austinites, they won't even know anything about the Austin Daily Tribune and its very brief life here in town as a daily newspaper. And as I mentioned, it's state government offices that now occupy that building. Although when they moved in, they apparently had an awkward time explaining the what's been described as Playboy bathroom of the penthouse. Not very well suited for a state office. But we're coming around here to get another great view of the Capitol and the side of the old bakery and emporium, which also has a nice little cafe garden out the side. They're not open yet right now, but hopefully by the time y'all get to Austin in person, they will be.
Like they're not open because it's too early in the day, or they're not open because of COVID?
Because of COVID, yeah. They haven't reopened during COVID yet, and I believe they're actually doing some renovations inside right now, so that might be delaying them too. But while we're heading down to Congress Avenue here, let us know, what have you seen so far that would make you the most excited to visit Austin? Anything here that's kind of sparking your interest so far for those of you who haven't been to town? And since I know there are some local Austinites on here, have I told you anything yet that you don't know?
Or anything that you'd say that she got wrong?
Oh yeah, correct me if I'm wrong.
Put it in the chat. We want your comments. Your comments let other people help other people find this video as a live stream right now, but also as a video later on. If someone's watching later on, they'll be able to find us easier based upon your comments.
Now we're across the street here, but if we can zoom in a little bit, Chris, on those flowers over there, I just want to show off our beautiful Texas bluebonnet for a second.
I'll zoom over to them.
Yeah, we'll zoom over there. You know, bluebonnets are one of our most common Texan wildflowers, and part of that is thanks to former First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson. Now, of course, President Lyndon B. Johnson and Lady Bird were both Central Texans themselves. And as First Lady, and then after her term as First Lady, one thing that Lady Bird was very passionate about was Texas plant life. And many of her personal projects and initiatives had to do with beautifying the city of. And one of those was her wildflower campaign to plant beautiful wildflowers all along the roadways of Central Texas. She also planted many live oak trees here downtown on Congress Avenue. We'll see a whole bunch of them. We'll pass by them on our way down the street here. But this is the prime time of year to come and visit Austin when the weather is great. It's not too hot. You've got all of these beautiful wildflowers blooming. And actually down in South Austin, we have the Lady Bird Wildflower Center, where you can see them all in their full glory.
Beautiful bees as well.
Oh yeah, love the bees.
Shannon says hi, bee. Carla says Sterling playing sax is my favorite thing.
Oh yeah.
Kristen says live music.
Yes.
Shannon says the fact that we can.
Absolutely.
What's your favorite thing about Austin so far?
Even a t-shirt, honestly, today is a little humid. You might see me a little shiny. You know, it gets hot here in the summer, but I would rather be hot than cold any day. We can catch a quick glimpse down the street of our beautiful seat of the local Archdiocese of the Catholic Church. That's St. Mary's Cathedral. It's the oldest Catholic church around. Beautiful old neo-Gothic building. And we're gonna head our way down Congress Avenue here. So Congress Avenue is kind of the main street of Texas. Like I mentioned, when Lamar established the city of Austin to be this grand bespoke capital of their new country, he argued that they should have a big avenue leading from what would eventually be the site of the Capitol, wasn't quite yet at that time, all the way down to the Colorado River. And so that's exactly what Congress Avenue was. And you know, today it's definitely sort of a government, business, and cultural center of town, but it wasn't always so grand. 1930s and through the 40s, 50s, 60s, Austin was still basically a pretty small frontier town. And Congress Avenue actually was just a big old stretch of red dirt road. And it still have herds of cattle and horses that were run up here all the time, kicking up big red clouds. And in fact, in the early days of Austin, the way that you actually secured a plot right here on the very desirable property of Congress Avenue was just to settle there and squat for a long enough period of time that you could claim it as your own. So nowadays things have changed a bit, although Congress Avenue wasn't paved until 1905. So even for almost 20 years after the big grand Capitol was built, there were still all those horses and cattle running around kicking up dust through here.
Ross has a quick question.
Yeah.
As we walk away from the Capitol, are there guided tours inside of the state Capitol?
Absolutely, good question. So them return before too long. But yes, typically they do have a free tour that they offer. It's about 40 minutes inside the Capitol. It leaves regularly throughout the day. So when you do get a chance to come to Austin, I highly recommend adding that to your itinerary. You'll get to see the beautiful building. You can also visit it yourself. You can grab a brochure for a self-guided tour if you prefer that kind of thing. But the guided tours are definitely great and they're free, so no reason not to.
Do the tips go to Governor Abbott?
I don't believe it's actually common to tip for those tours because those are actually State Preservation Board employees.
Just a free tour guide joke.
Just a free tour guide joke. Before we get too far down the block here though, I want to point out a couple things. So we just saw a great example of a mural, some amazing street art in Austin. That's a big part of our local culture here. You will see a lot of incredible street art. But I also want to point out some of these cool historic buildings that we're walking by because these are some of the oldest buildings still left on Congress Avenue, dating back to the 1870s. Now, as I mentioned, especially mid-20th century, historic buildings weren't all the rage, so many of them were torn down, but luckily these are some that did survive. And back in the 1870s, Austin was just kind of beginning to grow. And it was when actually it was permanently declared the final capital of Texas, because there had still been debate going on since 1839 on that topic. But this was touted as being the most beautiful business block in Austin while it was being built, and it was designed by perhaps the first architect in Austin, or at least the first one who was listed as an architect in the city directory. His name was Jacob Larmore, so the Larmore block. And today you'll see it houses restaurants, shops. Actually, where this boutique is right here, this used to be a livery stable. So if you can imagine, it went from housing horses back in the old days to now housing a cute little store. Now, Congress Avenue has kind of been through a lot of phases over the years. In the 1800s, it was the center business district of Austin. By the mid-20th century, it was kind of in that period of change where these old buildings were falling out of style, new ones were being built, and then in the 70s, like I mentioned, it was designated as a historic district. The older buildings were preserved, but one sort of catch to that was that a lot of restrictions were put into place about how you could redevelop these old buildings. And, you know, not all of them have quite gotten there yet. Across the street, we've got an interesting example of 3 older buildings which you'll see have some work to be done for sure. Now these also date back to about the same time, the 1870s. And you can see they haven't been redeveloped like the rest of the buildings that we've been passing by. They are actually a work in progress. There was just another meeting this past week to discuss what should be done with them. But long story short, it's been sort of a struggle, a tug of war between the owner of the buildings, who would like to develop them in a way to increase their volume, and the City Preservation Board and historical preservationists. So we'll see what happens here. One potential option is that he may choose to preserve the facades of the building and build something taller behind it. We'll see what happens with these, but I also want to point them out because the building right in the middle there, that white one, has a pretty interesting story of its own. Back in the late 19th century, one resident of Austin was a Prussian immigrant by the name of about with malaria. He expanded his business, which was previously selling plants and seeds, and he decided to start experimenting with plant-based medicines as well. So he actually developed his own sort of potion called Microbe Killer that he said would cure all different kinds of diseases and ailments. He said it had worked for him on his malaria, and even though, you know, it didn't have any really scientifically identifiable properties as a medicine, he still managed to sell a whole bunch of it, so much so that by the end of his life he lived in a mansion overlooking Central Park in New York City. But started for him right here in this building on Congress Avenue.
Not to interrupt, there's just a couple people have asked a couple questions.
Yeah.
So Jack, first of all, T, talking about the murals before,
Yeah.
I love them. Jack said that's some beautiful businesses back there. Shannon asked if there are apartments up there on the top.
Oh,
of these
yeah,
buildings.
good question.
And as we walk between places, maybe we'll just do a quick check-in with the chat.
Sure.
So that way I'm not bringing us back to where we've already been again.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question about apartments. So some of these buildings do house businesses on their floor and residences above. Others house office spaces above the ground floor buildings. But yes, we will see a few examples of additions. Actually, that building on the corner that houses the Quiznos, I think it is. We can't quite see it now. It's kind of hiding between the brick building, but there actually is one tiny little condo perched up there with a beautiful view towards the Capitol.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, great question.
Lorraine Yusha says, hi Laura.
Hey Lorraine, thanks so much for joining us. Now, as you'll see, some businesses are still kind of boarded up. A lot of people are still working from home around town. So downtown Congress Avenue, we're sort of slowly returning to a state of normalcy, but we're definitely in progress.
It's true. It's true. You're an influencer now. Welcome.
Hey! And then we're going to take kind of a look from a distance at one cool building over that way, Chris, when we get over here. So,
it's worth mentioning, how long ago did we meet each other?
Oh yeah, we met, let's see, it's about an hour ago now, 90 minutes.
and how many times did we walk through this route before we did it just now?
None. We're doing this on the fly, you know.
I'm discovering it the same time you guys are discovering it, so sorry if my camera's a little bit behind sometimes.
Thanks, Lenore, for your comments. Seahorse9, if that's you. Now I want to point out, and Chris, get you to zoom in here on that cool building about half a block down the street on the other side there on 9th Street.
The one with the flag outside?
Yeah, that is the old Millet Opera House. Now Austin in its early years had a number of different performance halls housed inside of other buildings, but this was the first really dedicated opera house, theater house, and it hosted not only theater productions but also all kinds of social. It was really a center of the local Austin culture in the 1880s. But it met its downfall with the advent of electric lighting, because Captain Millet, who owned this opera house, he was a bit old-fashioned, and when electric lights came into style, he absolutely refused to outfit his theater with them. And, well, another man in town, Mr. Hancock, built his own opera house that was very brightly lit and immediately stole all the clientele from the old Millet place. So within a year, the Millet Opera House shut down and then was actually reopened as a skating rink and a storage space for a while. Interesting uses for such a grand building. Now, it was later owned by the Knights of Columbus, the fraternal order, who added that beautiful portico, that deck out front. And nowadays it's owned by the prestigious Austin Club, which is membership, a lot of businessmen, politicians, decision makers around town, and they have tried their best to sort of restore the interior to its former glory. I've never gotten a look inside yet myself, but I hear it's pretty grand.
We could apply to be a server or a cook, apparently. They're hiring.
Oh, yes.
So worst comes to worst.
You know, I've also heard that on their application for new members, they do warn you of the ghost of the old opera house, an actress named Priscilla, who supposedly fell to her death from the catwalk one evening. A story which is a complete urban legend. Now, one thing I love in Austin is that, like any city, we have a lot of great ghost stories.
You're going to get Shannon all crazy. She loves ghost stories.
That's great.
She's going to want to hear a ghost story. You're going to have to tell one.
You know, I've got some up my sleeve. We're actually approaching a good location for a good ghost story here. But of course, you know, one thing that's so interesting about ghost stories is always to see where they come from, if you can even identify that. You know, which ghost stories are really based in historical events, could potentially, you know, have some basis in reality, and which ones are just total inventions. So, you know, it depends. Some stories, some ghosts in Austin do seem to stem from real events, and others it's a little unclear where the tales came from. We're gonna head back across the street here in a second, check out another really cool mural that's a little bit older. That one we saw back down the street was brand new, very fresh. But this one that we're coming up on now, you'll maybe recognize some of the things you'll see in this mural. Oh, here we go. Let's get across the street real quick. Now, this mural that we're coming up to was painted by a local artist named Mouth. And he's a really great person to know in the local art scene. He was the founder of an organization called Spray TX, which provides professional development and all different kinds of resources and support for local artists in town. And this one was actually painted as a part of the 8th Street Mural Project. So this is a public art project. It's called the Party at the Moon Tower mural. We'll talk in a second a little bit more about what a moon tower is. But first I want y'all to notice that on this mural, you meet probably our most famous local Austinite, Mr. Matthew Mcconaughey. And actually the mural itself is dedicated to and inspired by the 1993 movie Dazed and Confused, which was filmed here in Austin, directed by Richard Linklater, our darling local film director.
All right.
Absolutely. Now, if you're not familiar with Richard Linklater, you might have seen some of his movies and not known it. Boyhood was one that is a little more recent. Well, not quite recent yet at this point anymore. But one that I definitely recommend checking out is actually his very first movie, Slacker, which is from the early 90s. And there's not a lot of a storyline to it, but it does really give you a good sense of early before the big tech boom began, before the population really started to explode, when it was still a more laid-back city filled with artists and musicians, which to some extent it definitely still is. But the vibe was definitely a little slower paced, a little different back then. So check out Slacker to get an idea of that. You can see our Capitol building here. Now, Mr. Matthew Mcconaughey, as I mentioned, our most famous Austinite probably, he was born and raised here, got his film degree at UT actually the same year that he starred in Dazed and Confused, shooting him to fame. And he does still live around town. He actually teaches at UT now, a very popular class for film students called From Script to Screen. And actually, coming back this way for just a sec, now we're seeing our moon tower. So Party at the Moon Tower, that's a quote from Dazed and Confused. But what the heck is a moon tower? Well, here we've got one. And if you come to Austin, you will still see about 15 moon towers up around our streets. Now back in the 1880s, these were kind of considered as perhaps the next big thing in urban lighting. Better than a street lamp, they were very tall, they could light up an entire neighborhood at once. We don't have one right around here that I can show you in real life, but many cities, Detroit, several cities in California, had these installed at the time. However, by the mid-1890s, just a decade later, they were already really starting to fall out of fashion. They were pretty impractical, difficult to maintain, lit with carbon vapor filaments like a gas lamp that had to be replaced every single day. So electricians had to go up all these towers every day in these little pulley elevators, very frightening, and change out those filaments. And you know, once taller buildings were built around them, they really lost their function. But in Austin, our buildings were pretty short. And in the 1890s, and while most other cities took them down, not long afterwards, we kept ours up. And they went from carbon vapor filaments to, of course, other types of lighting over the years. But they did also have their own share of issues. Now, in the movie Dazed and Confused, Party at the Moon Tower, you know, the high schoolers talk about having a party at the Moon Tower. That's a fictional event. But in 1930, there was one 11-year-old boy who was dared by his friend to climb one. He got all the way to the top and then fell all the way down to the bottom. And incredibly, didn't break a single bone. Saved, he actually did end up in a coma for a little bit, but he was totally fine. And you know, by the 1940s, we were the only city to still have them. World War II began. We needed to be able to go dark in case of air raids, and there actually was no way to turn the towers off at that time. So the city did have to do some rethinking. And then by the 1990s, 100 years after we got them, we were the only city in the world. And the question was raised, keep them around or take them down? But the Austinites figured this is one more thing that is now unique and weird to Austin. Let's keep them.
If we see one, I'll camera in on it.
Yeah, you know, we might, there's one a block up that way. But
just as we're going, you know, questions coming in,
yeah.
Or comments. Jack says, fun fact, my dad's neighbor's ex-partner, it was the bouncer in Slacker.
Oh, yay. Yeah, you know, especially people who grew up in Austin, it's definitely not unusual to have some connections. Another really cool piece of street art here that is quite new, actually. This was just installed last summer. It's by an artist named Daniel Horning. And we can see this very bright, psychedelic horse and rider, which he intended to sort of showcase and also to represent the idea that as you approach something you desire, it gets further and further away from you. So we have this beautiful horse and rider here. And we're starting to see definitely increasing amounts of street art of all different types, not just murals, but sculptures like this, other kinds of pieces. So actually, let's take a quick little detour up this way. We'll get a look at a moon tower here for y'all. Now, some of the concerns about moon towers before they were installed didn't turn out to be so much of an issue. But before I tell you about that, I want to forget not to mention real quick that this corner was actually the site of the very first capital of Texas. That 2-room log cabin back in the 1840s was right here on this corner. So not quite the grand spot that our final capital would end up in. But yeah, you know, these moon towers, they were sort of this strange newfangled. They were concerned that their chickens would get confused. They wouldn't know when to lay eggs. They thought their plants might overgrow and overtake the city. Now, neither of those turned out to be issues at all. But when Austin did decide to completely renovate and repair these moon towers in the mid-1990s, cost them over $2 million and over 2 years as well. So when they finally were finished, they reopened, re-inaugurated the towers with a huge citywide festival. And you will still find a lot of mentions of moon towers around town. We're definitely very proud of them. They're an important part of our local cityscape and culture. So we've got the Moon Tower Comedy Festival every spring. We've got the Moon Tower Saloon, Moon Tower Brass Band, Moon Tower Party Rental Company. Oh, the cidery. Yeah, Moon Tower Cider. That's really good. And so right up this way, we can get a look at one of those moon towers. You know, when you first look at that, you probably wouldn't even really notice it. You think it's a cell tower, radio tower, something like that. But that is a moon tower or a moonlight tower. Unique now to Austin. Like I said, we've got about 15 of those left. And they are now lit by LED bulbs, so they're much more efficient and require a lot less maintenance than in the old days.
Wow. You know, before when you were saying that this was from 1890, I thought you were messed up and meaning to say 1980.
Oh no.
But that's incredible that it really is. I mean, like that
Oh,
does
yeah.
not look like something built, you know, in the 1800s.
No, absolutely not. And you know, like I said, when they first were invented, a lot of people, this is how all of our cities are going to be lit. But that idea definitely didn't last too long. They pretty quickly proved to be too much of a hassle for most of the cities that installed them. But you know, here we love things that are a little bit unique and different. You probably heard our catchphrase, keep Austin weird. And maybe you've wondered where that comes from. You know, who coined that phrase? Well, it actually was started by the Austin Independent Business Alliance back in the 90s. When Austin really began to grow, when its population began to boom, the tech industry was really being drawn here. A lot of locals, of course, were concerned that their small, unique local businesses would be driven out of this really quickly growing city. So the Independent Business Alliance, well, they kind of caught onto this catchphrase, but they actually weren't the first ones to invent it. That was a local librarian who came up with the idea in the first place and started to print bumper stickers at his own home that said, keep Austin, and started to distribute them around town. It was his way of trying to encourage the locals as the city grew to keep being themselves, keep being unique. But the Independent Business Alliance also kind of took it a step further. They saw it as a way to encourage Austinites to continue to support their unique local businesses too. So they jumped on the bandwagon, started making their own bumper stickers, and took the phrase even more wide. So, you know, other cities have kind of tried to copy us a little bit. You'll hear keep Portland weird these days, keep Louisville weird, but it did originate here in Austin, all with one public librarian.
Teague wants to know, how bright are those moonlights at night? Do they radiate a lot of light, or is it more of a dull hum?
Yeah, you know, these days, of course, they're a little bit mitigated by the fact that we have so many other electric lights, especially right down here in the downtown core. But they are, you know, a moon-like glow. And that's actually exactly what they were said to offer. That's why they were given their name in the first place. Because in the old days of those carbon vapor filaments, they actually did emit sort of a bluish light specifically. The LED bulbs they have today are, you know, a little more white, yellow light. But back in that time, it really was said to be this very sort of calming, soothing, moon-like glow. But yes, they absolutely did light well enough to provide a lot of safety to the nearby neighborhoods. Sure.
Over this.
Yeah.
It's too loud.
And actually, you know, there's a very popular myth around town that we got our moon towers due to our first and most infamous serial killer in town. A man who has been dubbed the Servant Girl Annihilator, who killed, as you can imagine, servant girls primarily in the mid-1880s over the course of about 1 year. His identity is still a mystery to this day. There are a number of different theories out there about who he could have been. But he was, well, he's considered by some to actually be the first serial killer in American history, or at least the first one to get a really catchy name assigned to him, the serial killer, the Servant Girl Annihilator. And he got that name actually from our most famous author in Austin history, who is O. Henry, the short story writer. Now you might think of his name primarily today associated with the candy bar that got named after him, but about 100 years ago, he was actually a house rather early 1900s. He was one of the most published authors in the United States. He wrote short stories that were syndicated in newspapers all over the country, so millions of Americans read his work 100+ years ago. He did live here in Austin, and it was in a letter to a friend of his in the summer of 1885 when the Servant Girl Annihilator was active. He wrote to his friend that Austin was pretty quiet over the summer, except for the exploits of the Servant Girl Annihilator, who are keeping people on their toes. So we have him to thank for that catchy name. Just to pop real quick here into the window of Kruger. This is a local jeweler, family owned. They have been open, as you can see, for over 100 years here on Congress Avenue since the 1930s. But you'll see in the window and throughout the store lots of cool historic photos in addition to beautiful jewelry. And I want to point out especially we've got a panorama from 1910. So you can see the Capitol all the way down Congress Avenue to where we are now, and the beautiful Driscoll Hotel off there on the right-hand side. So you can really see how much Austin's grown in the last 110 years. And then next to it, we've got a photo from the inauguration of the Capitol building. As I mentioned, that was completed in 1888 to much affair. They actually organized a whole week of special events and festivities to celebrate the inauguration of the Capitol, and about 20,000 people showed up, which is about twice the population of Austin at the time, actually. So they had to set up these huge campgrounds all over town to accommodate people who were coming from all over Central Texas to come and see this beautiful grand Capitol, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the 7th largest building in the world at the time. So pretty big, pretty street here at some of our beautiful historic old theaters. Now we've got the Paramount Theater here, which originally when it opened in 1915 was called the Majestic. It was a vaudeville theater, and even Harry Houdini once performed there. So in the 1920s it was bought by Paramount Films. So then, of course, it got its name changed, had that beautiful marquee put up, and became Austin's first movie palace. So in the silent film days, sometimes they had just a single organist performing there, but sometimes they had a full-size orchestra, and that's an experience that they actually, on occasion, do recreate for modern audiences today. In 1966, the theater actually hosted the world premiere of the very first Batman movie, and the original Batmobile advertised for the film by driving all day long up and down Congress Avenue. But actually that beautiful marquee disappeared right around the same time. It was taken down to be repaired and then somehow never seen again. And it actually wasn't until 2015 that they finally recreated one, but because they didn't have the original schematics for it, they actually had to rely on archival footage and photographs to do their best to recreate the original. But actually, we're very lucky that this theater is here still today, because by the early 1970s, it actually wasn't in such great shape. The building was really falling into disrepair. They weren't selling enough tickets to the movies to keep it up, and so they actually it was in danger of being demolished. When a couple of local guys teamed up to save it, they started a foundation, collected over $2 million in donations, restored the building, and also brought live performances back. So it does still offer film, but also you'll find dance, music, comedy there, as well as Austin Film Festival, the film branch of South by Southwest. And since I know we have some ghost story lovers here.
Really quick,
yeah,
before we go into the next story, two things. First one is how we've gone over an hour. We're like an hour and 10 minutes right now, and it might make sense for us to do a pause now to do an episode 1, episode 2.
Okay.
In case we're going to go for another 30-45 minutes, maybe.
Yeah.
If we're going to keep on going,
let's do it.
Then this is something that we've imagined doing, and we're just going to say this is the end of episode 1.
Okay.
We're not going to stop streaming. So for all you folks who are part of the live stream right now, like, don't worry about it. We're not actually going anywhere. We're just going to. We realize that 2 hours is too long for you guys to have to sit and watch a video necessarily. We love the fact that you're live streaming with us and staying right now. Anyway, so don't go anywhere. We're just going to put in a break that will be deleted out later on, and no one who watches the YouTube video will ever know that this happened. Just you guys know that this happened. That's the end of episode 1 of Best of Austin, and thank you so much. See you guys in episode 2, and then we'll just say welcome to episode 2.
All right, great.
All right, you guys know what's happening. Here it
so,
goes.
Thanks so much for joining us
Let me All right, thank you guys for being part of our production here. Okay, so.
Thanks so much for joining us on episode 1 of Best of Austin. And welcome to episode 2 of Best of Austin. I'm a little newer at this than Chris is, you can tell.
No, he's perfect. It was awesome. You crushed it. Okay,
so we're here across from the Paramount Theater, and let me tell you a little bit about its 2 ghosts. Now, before a theater was built here, back in the days of the Republic of Texas, this was the location of the War Department. And it's said that one woman came one day to the War Department wondering about the fate of her husband, who had not returned home after the battle for independence. And she was told here at the War Department that her husband unfortunately had died, and she collapsed right there. It ever since. Now, the story of the war widow, no way to verify that. But the story of the ghost, well, that we have a little more actually recent evidence of. Because just a couple years ago, a touring pianist, not a local, didn't know anything about the Paramount Theater or its ghost stories. You know, he was doing his sound check in the afternoon, and once the sound check was done, he looked out into the beautiful open theater. It is a gorgeous theater inside there, and he took a picture of the big empty auditorium. But when he looked back at that picture later, there actually was the figure of a woman in white sitting clearly in the balcony staring down at him. So when he showed it to the theater employees, of course, they told him, "We have a lady in white who haunts the theater here." But even more recently than that, in the year 2000, now one thing that the Paramount is well known for is its very popular summer classic film series. It's one of the best ways for Austinites to escape the heat in the summertime, sit in a nice cool theater for a very cheap ticket price, and enjoy old classic films. Now in the year 2000, their longtime projectionist, Walter Norris, he'd been working at the Paramount pretty much since they reopened in the 1970s. Now he was just loading the second reel of his own favorite classic film, Casablanca, when unfortunately he suffered a heart attack. So it's been said ever since that he is still hanging out in the projection room to this day. And of course you can see our duck tour here. Because we've got that beautiful Colorado River running right through our city, we're a great place to do a duck tour.
Oh yeah?
Oh yeah.
It's one of the few cities I know where they haven't banned duck tours yet.
Oh really?
there's been a unfortunately, I mean, it's not a joking incident, but it's
right.
There's been a number of fatal fatalities related to duck tours in the last couple of years.
Well,
sort of like helicopters seem safer. Whoop.
Real quick here, just want to point out another cool historic building to y'all from the 1870s. And this one is especially unique because it was built in that Reconstruction era, post-Civil War. This is the Walter Tipps building. It's got this beautiful sort of neo-Renaissance style to it, but actually the support girder of this building was made from recycled shells from the Confederate Army, which just goes to show that even when you were building something great, you know, things weren't necessarily great economically. You probably still had to cut a few corners, make some budget choices. So that's how they built this building here, recycling those Confederate shells. And as we get to the corner here, we're going to see a great cultural institution of Austin, the Jones Center, which is the second smaller branch of our Contemporary Art Museum. It's this cool glass building here that we're approaching on the corner.
As we're approaching, just Shannon asks, "What's a duck tour?" and Teague jumps in to make fun of me for our Peabody Hotel in Memphis duck visit, which is not the same thing. That was a duck tour where we were looking at live ducks. Not a duck boat tour.
A literal duck tour. Love it. Yeah, duck tours are kind of an amphibious tour vehicle. So they're a boat on the river or the lake through downtown. Now, since we're looking over here, across the street from us is the Intercontinental Hotel, or actually I believe it's changed ownership recently. But it was the Intercontinental Hotel for a long time. This place was built in 1924. It was at one time the tallest building in Austin. And as you can see at the top, they actually added floors gradually over time to make it even taller. On the second floor though, open to everyone, is the Stephen F. Austin Bar. And it's got a beautiful terrace with an amazing view of Congress Avenue and the Capitol Building. But you might have noticed it shares a name with our city, Austin. And Stephen F. Austin is actually the namesake of the city. He's known as the father of Texas, and that's because back in the 1820s, while Tejas was still a part of Mexico, he was one of those Americans recruiting people to move here, and he brought hundreds of families to settle. Name given to the capital when it was established in 1839. But to slowly bring our view back over to this side of the street, as I mentioned, we've got the Jones Center over here. Now, our Contemporary Art Museum in Austin has a larger location as well. It's a beautiful estate called Laguna Gloria on the west side of town, an Italian-style villa housing our permanent art collection and our local art school. But by the 90s, they wanted a more central location too, a place for temporary exhibits where they could host work from artists all over the world. So they opened the Jones Center here. And now they've usually got 2 to 3 different temporary exhibits featured throughout the course of the year. Like I said, by artists, not just from Austin, but international artists. Great place to come and check out some incredible contemporary art. And if you look all the way up towards the top, and once we get across the street, you see a very large work of art on display up there. With liberty and justice for all, it says. That piece was installed there a few years ago. It was created by an artist named Jim Hodges. And I love how clever he was when titling this piece, because of course it is finished, but its title is With Liberty and Justice for All, a Work in Progress. And Congress Avenue being the main street of Texas leading right up to the state capitol building, as you can imagine, it's pretty typical for marches and rallies and political events to take place here on Congress Avenue, heading right up past this piece of work. So, pretty relevant to our position in state politics.
Jack writes.
Yeah. According to Wikipedia, the Goliad Massacre happened today in 1836. Oh yeah, thank you, Jack, for that bit of Texas independence history. So the Battle of Goliad we briefly mentioned when we were looking at the African American History Memorial. That was a major battle in Texas in 1836. So thank you so much, Jack, for telling us that today is the anniversary of that battle. And we're actually headed over here to meet a very important figure in Austin's local history. Her name is Angelina Eberle, and in fact, she is probably a big part of the reason why Austin even became the big city that it is today. Because, like we've talked about, there was some debate about where the capital of the independent Republic of Texas should be. Houston, the better established city. There were some other ideas thrown into the ring as well. But Austin here was established as the capital, and as we know, it was sort of a small frontier town at the time. Now, Houston argued this was not a safe place to keep the Texas archives. All of their important legal documents, historical documents, those were stored here at the time in the General Land Office building. But one thing that Houston did in his bid to move the capital to Houston was to claim that the archives should be kept in a safer location. So he actually sent some men here to, well, in the Austinites' view, steal the archives from the city. And when these men showed up at the General Land Office building and loaded up these archives after dark, Angelina realized that something was up. Now, she actually ran a boarding house nearby. Sam Houston had lived there even at one point, so I think she knew he was a little bit sneaky in getting what he wanted. And she ran right out into the street. Now, Austin being out on the frontier, they did have a cannon just kind of permanently installed in the middle of Congress Avenue, just in case they ever were attacked. And so Angelina loaded up a cannonball and shot it right over into the General Land Office building. Fortunately, nobody was injured, but that is the one shot of what we now very dramatically today call the Texas Archive War. Now, the documents and the men with the cart fled right out of town, but thanks to Angelina, while the Austinites were hot on their tail, they caught up just 18 miles away and managed to convince, well, rather surround the guys with the documents and get them to give them back. Then they all actually returned back to Austin and had a big reconciliatory feast as the women in town had been cooking the entire time they were gone. And well, we really do have Angelina to thank for that, and for Austin remaining the capital city of Texas and growing into the city that we have today. Because, well, if in the 1840s Houston had become the capital instead, Austin might have stayed a little frontier town, never have become a big metropolis like it is today. But let's head a little further down Congress Avenue. While we're on our way there, some great local businesses across the street. We can hear some great live music going on in front of Wild About Music, which is a good place to get your music-themed souvenirs.
So Teek says Canon is very dramatic, and it's dramatic history. Thank you, Teek, for chiming in. Always pleasure. And Patrick, guide. A couple hours before your tour right now, from the Gothic district in Barcelona, just give you some applause.
Oh, thank you so much, Patrick. I appreciate the applause. I'll have to go and check out your tour. Now, you might have heard Austin is the live music capital of the world. Do you agree? I know that there are a lot of cities out there who might compete with us for the title. Nashville, of course, comes to mind. So who decided exactly that we are the live music capital of the world? How did we get that title? Well, the truth is, it was an advertising campaign in the 90s trying to bring more tourism to this growing city, and they did originally consider live music capital of the universe before deciding we don't know what music is like on Mars. That's just not fair. But at least in terms of the human world, they did point out that at the time we had per capita the most live music venues of any city, about 300 in the mid-90s music venues where you could find live music playing for about 500,000 people who lived in town at the time. But as y'all know, we have about doubled our population since then, and even pre-COVID, we were sadly down to about 250 music venues. We've lost a handful in the last year. So, you know, hopefully we'll see a lot of that music scene reviving soon, but I still think we deserve the title, even if the per capita thing isn't true anymore, because the reality is that we have an incredible live music scene here in Austin, and not just the styles of music that you might expect to hear in Texas. A lot of people come and ask, is it just country music? Is it just blues? And of course you'll find great places to see those styles of music here in Austin, but one thing that I think makes the Austin music scene really special is that it is very eclectic. And a lot of the bands here in town, you might struggle to sort of put into one genre or another, but a lot of people are combining different influences together and experimenting with new sounds. So that Austin style of music is, well, very eclectic, and I definitely recommend coming here to check it out yourself, or again, listen to KUTX if you're far away, get a little taste of the great local music scene. And now from this corner, some of our major skyscrapers. In fact, we get kind of a history of the Austin skyscraper right here on this corner. Across from us is the Scarborough Building. This was our first Chicago-style skyscraper, finished in 1910 to house the Scarborough department store. And at 8 stories tall, it was not only the tallest here in town, but anywhere between New Orleans and San Francisco. But it didn't keep that title for very long because, well, Mr. Scarborough's building was being built. A very competitive banker in town, Mr. George Washington Littlefield, decided to break ground on his own building, and just to make sure his would be taller, he built an extra half-story inn that you can see up near the top of it, where you see that bright gold Littlefield. Now, at first his building was 8.5 stories tall, and it had this beautiful roof garden on top. So it was one of the most luxurious places in town for people to enjoy the incredible view as they were on the top. As taller buildings were built in the city, well, Littlefield really wanted to keep his title as tallest, so he walled in that roof garden, added an extra floor to his building just to make sure he would be the tallest a little longer. And actually in this building, Lyndon B. Johnson had one of his first government offices back in the 1930s when he was the statewide director for the National Youth Association. And he was a very hard worker. Even back then, he worked long hours late into the night by gas lamp because they turned the electricity off on him every night promptly at 10:30 p.m. So we're going to continue our way down Congress Avenue here. And as we do, we're going to see a couple more big skyscrapers. You might have noticed this big black building across the street from us, the Bank of America Tower. That was one of the first, what we would really consider skyscrapers, built in Austin in the 1970s, early 80s. And it was around that time, with some of these taller towers being built, that Austinites started to become concerned about their views of the Capitol building. They wanted to make sure that even as the city grew, the Capitol grand view would still be visible from all over town. So in the mid-70s, the Capitol View corridors were inaugurated, and by now there are over 30 different viewpoints around town whose views of the Capitol are protected by law. So a lot of buildings around Austin that have sort of interesting shapes to them often are because they're avoiding those view corridors, avoiding blocking that view. Now, the shortest corridors are only a few blocks long. The longest one's about 5.7 miles, all the way out to a beautiful vista in West Austin. And in fact, 2.5 miles is a Capitol View corridor, which is why these days you can't build a big tall skyscraper all the way out to the edge of the street, but instead there are a lot of height restrictions and setbacks that buildings are required to abide by to ensure that those views are kept clear.
T-Gas, just really quick, Austin Mcconaughey? Austin Mcconaughey,
Let me see.
originally from Texas, but it's been in Miami for a long time. Any chance that Austin is from this Austin?
Oh, you know, I'm not familiar with them, so not sure about that one. But I want to direct your view across the street again to some really cool murals over on the side of the Mexicarte Museum. Now that museum first was established in the mid-80s in what used to be Austin's warehouse district, right along the Colorado River. Moved here downtown to Congress Avenue a few years later. We're going to cross this way actually. We'll stay on this side of the street. But the Mexicarte Museum is one of the few in the country that really focuses on celebrating and educating about the Mexican heritage and history as well. So those murals get switched out pretty often. You'll see a lot of them, a lot of artists who, both from Austin and coming from other cities around the world, come and represent their work there. But the museum itself also holds prints, sculptures, paintings, ceremonial masks, all kinds of incredible art, and have a lot of education outreach programs as well. So very cool place. And next door, we'll get a good look up at one of Austin's most iconic skyscrapers. Kind of kicked off the current round of our more contemporary, newer tall buildings in Austin. Now this is the Frost Bank headquarters, and it was actually the first skyscraper to break ground in the US after 9/11, so it holds significance. It's also been one of the most beautiful in the Austin skyline for a long time, although there's actually kind of a funny rumor and myth about the building itself. Now a lot of people say that the top actually looks like an owl's face, and some people think that the architect designed it to reflect the mascot of Rice University, where he supposedly went to school, and that's in Houston. So a lot of people think that he did that as sort of a jab at Austin. But even though it's kind of a great story, it's also not true. In fact, the architecture firm who designed this building had nothing to do with Texas at all, or Rice University. So not sure where that story came from, but you'll likely hear locals repeating it around town. And actually this building behind us, to turn around here real quick, has some interesting history of its own. Now houses a bar called Speakeasy, but back in 1916, this was the home of the Southwestern Telephone and Telegraph Company, and a fire broke out in July that year. Now, the phones were ringing off the hook with people calling in to report the fire or ask about the fire, and so the poor telephone operators actually stayed at their posts while the building burnt, and only managed to safely evacuate just 3 minutes before some of the walls collapsed in on themselves. So the version that we see here today is kind of a rebuilt version of the old Chrysler building from the late 19th century. But it's one of many places in town where you can catch live music. Oh, I'm sure it does, yeah.
That smell of old beer and air conditioning.
Oh, that delicious smell.
Yeah. Now what's going on over here?
Oh yeah, we've got a pub crawler. Austin's a big party city. You know, we've got a big nightlife and entertainment scene here. And in the last couple years, I have heard that we've actually stolen the title of Bachelor and Bachelorette Party Capital of the country. Previously was Nashville, but apparently we have overtaken them as the most popular location.
Congratulations.
So that's a pretty common sight around town these days. And I'm gonna swearing that that is indeed a bachelorette party.
I was impressed that half of them were on their phones at the same time texting.
Yeah, you know, luckily they don't have to steer that thing. They just have to pedal.
And drink.
And drink, of course. And sing. They actually make them sing a lot of the time.
Do you sing?
I actually am a singer. Historically, that is my trade, you might say. I actually attended Berklee College of Music in Boston, and then ended up living in Paris for a year and a half, which is actually where I first worked as a tour guide. So I moved to Paris after college and really randomly saw an ad looking for English speakers to guide tours. And I'd always, you know, music had always been my primary passion, but I've always loved history and culture. Luckily grew up in a family that loved traveling and thought that sounded like a lot of fun. So about a year and a half, I was a tour guide in Paris. I got to do the Louvre, the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame, all the main sites. Had an incredible time, but then moved to Austin, came here for grad school, back to studying music, and sort of let that go. But eventually when I ended up deciding to stay in Austin and leave academia, I wanted to get back into tour guiding and now show people the city that I've really adopted as my permanent home. So even though I'm not a born and raised Austinite, I'd like to think that I've legitimated myself, hopefully here, by learning enough about Austin that even my born and raised Austinite fiance says that I know more than he does. Now, yeah.
Sterling says Austin Mahone, to answer Teek's question.
Oh,
to
yeah.
answer Teek's question, Sterling. I have to talk to you, Mike. Sterling says that Austin Mahone is from San Antonio, Texas.
Oh, yeah.
Whoever, it's a music.
Music at a very important location. Now across the street you can see that little tan 2-story building. That's the home of the Elephant Room. Down in the basement underground there, it's Austin's premier jazz club since 1991. But there's a fun story behind its name too, the Elephant Room, because in the mid-80s, this big office tower was being built right behind it here. And in excavating to build the foundation for that building, they actually uncovered some woolly mammoth bones deep underground. Nobody had really known before that woolly mammoths had inhabited this area, so it was a very surprising find. You can now see those bones on display on campus in the Natural History Museum. But when the Elephant Room opened a few years later, they thought, well, hey, the elephants were down here hanging out underground, and we will be too in the basement of this building, so let's call it the Elephant Room. But another very important location to turn around here, Patagonia! Just kidding. Patagonia is great, but this building is actually one of the most important in Austin's music history. Now back in the 1960s, Austin was a much smaller college town, but a lot of young students were arriving in town at the time, and as you can imagine, being the 1960s, a lot of them were sort of hippies. And when they got here, there just were not many places for them to go see the kinds of music that they wanted, or for those starting bands themselves, psychedelic rock, things like that. No venue in town was going to book that kind of thing in what was still a more conservative, smaller town at the time. So in the fall of 1967, a group of students rented out this building for just $350 a month. At the time, as we've talked about, these older buildings were considered pretty undesirable, and we're getting some waves here from the staff inside Patagonia. I miss y'all. Normally on a live tour, we would actually go inside because they have some really cool posters and artifacts on display from the days as a music venue. So hi, it's so good to see you.
Jealous of your air conditioning.
Yeah,
You feel it.
that's another plus of going inside for sure. But yeah, 1967, group of students opened here the Vulcan Gas Company. This was Austin's really first eclectic music venue. They also had the first light show in town. But for those psychedelic rock bands like the 13th Floor Elevators, who went on to influence a lot of other psych bands of the late 60s and 70s, and bands like Shiva's Headband, who were the first rock band in Austin to win a major recording contract. They were the house band here at the Vulcan Gas Company. They played pretty much every night. A really cool sort of psychedelic country band. So like we talked about earlier, putting two things together that you wouldn't necessarily think would go. But this was really an amazing creative place, not only for musicians, but there was also the Armadillo Art Squad based here, making all the posters for the show and all other kinds of art. And they actually really started to attract a broader diversity of artists to Austin, which again was a pretty small town still. It really put Austin sort of on the musical map, so to speak, for more eclectic artists who, like the Velvet Underground and Captain Beefheart, who never really would have come to Austin before. Now all of a sudden we're attracted to play here at this cool place, the Vulcan Gas Company. Now the venue only lasted for about 3 years. They sold their tickets super cheap because it was a student-run venue. They didn't have a liquor license, so eventually the rent caught up with them and they had to shut down. But luckily Shiva's headband had just won their big recording contract, gotten their first royalty check, and so they helped with funding to start up a new venue, the Armadillo World Headquarters, which was not here downtown but South Austin. And then over the course of the 70s, that was really sort of the headquarters, literally, of Austin's eclectic live music scene. It's where Willie Nelson played his first local show when he moved here to town in 1972. And many people name it as the place that birthed the Austin sound of music and the eclectic live music scene that we still have here today. But of course, one important musician in Austin history is Miss Janice Joplin. Now, Janice was originally from a very small town on the coast of Texas. And I hope we have some Janice Joplin fans out there. Put your favorite Janice song into the comments if you have one, so that if there's anybody who's not familiar, they can, go and check her out. As y'all know, she was an incredibly unique performer and personality. And in the very small coastal Texas town of Port Arthur, she did not fit in very well. So as a teenager, at the age of 19, she came here to Austin in 1962 and enrolled at UT to study actually visual art. But, she's actually started her music career here as well at a very famous venue called Threadgill's. It was one of the longest running venues in Austin. It did unfortunately permanently close. It leaves an incredible legacy behind, including being the place where Janice Joplin played many of her first gigs. And in fact, I want to give a special shout out to Threadgill's too, because my fiance Sterling, the saxophone player y'all have heard about so far, well, his mom is actually a Threadgill. She grew up performing with the Threadgill family band, her and her 8 siblings touring all over the state of Texas. So if you ask a Texan, the Threadgill family name is definitely one that goes along with music. And Kenny Threadgill was the one who ran Threadgill's. Now, Threadgill's itself had actually been a gas station back in the early 1930s. Kenny sold booze under the counter during Prohibition, was the first one in town to get a beer sales license when that ended, and so turned his gas station into a bar, and for decades hosted some of the best jams, musical gatherings. So it was an incredible place for musicians to come together, and he himself was also a great singer-songwriter of country music. But even though Janice was a lot younger when she showed up in Austin in the friends, and actually one of the last performances she gave just 3 months before her death in 1970, she canceled a show in Hawaii at the last minute that was going to pay her $15,000, and instead she flew home to Austin and surprised Kenny at his birthday party, which was a big picnic which attracted thousands of people every year, and she came here to sing a song on stage with him. Now across the street from us right now, I want to point out a cool little spot that's kind of hidden from view actually. We're going to cross over there to get a closer look. But yeah.
What's like the most famous song by that?
Oh, by Janice Joplin?
No, by the Threadgills.
Oh, I can't think of one off the top of my head. I honestly haven't listened to a lot of Kenny Threadgill's music myself. But one thing he was especially known for, he had actually met Jimmie Rodgers at one point as a young man. Another very famous country singer who y'all might know, was especially known for his yodeling skills. And Jimmie Rodgers did actually teach Kenny Threadgill how to yodel. So that was also something that he incorporated into a lot of his performances.
Jack shouts out Turtle Blues as being one of
Oh, thanks, Jack. Yeah.
And Michaela says she was born 1 year after Janice Joplin's death.
Oh, wow.
Definitely giving away Michaela's age.
Thanks for being so upfront with us, Michaela. We appreciate your honesty and your contributions. And we're passing right now a great little spot. Like I mentioned earlier, Austin's really grown into sort of a foodie city. As it's gotten bigger, we're known for our music and our street art and that kind of thing, but we're also these days really becoming more known for our food scene too. But you definitely don't have to drop a lot of money to eat some good food here in Austin. Of course, we've got tons of food trucks, tacos to be found everywhere. But this is actually a really cool spot here that opened up just a few years ago. And it's actually a little sort of food court market style place in the basement of one of Austin's office buildings here right downtown. It's called the Fairground, but F-A-R-E, like food, fair, the Fairground. And it actually features down in the basement there a bunch of stalls from some of Austin's most popular restaurants. So it's a great place when you are here in town exploring downtown Congress Avenue. Grab a quick break here at the Fairground, and all in one go you can try little things, small plates from a whole bunch of different popular Austin restaurants. You can enjoy our beautiful weather with a little picnic out here on this big lawn. So definitely recommend checking that out when you're in town. And we're gonna wrap up in just a minute here, but before we do, I wanna take y'all just here to the end of Congress Avenue downtown. But actually there's a lot more of Congress Avenue once you get into South Austin. And the neighborhood of South Congress is definitely one of the hippest these days around town. You'll find a lot of cool little boutiques, shops, restaurants on that part of Congress Avenue. We're not gonna head down there ourselves because it's a little bit of a walk from here, but I just wanted to let y'all know when you do come to Austin, you'll definitely wanna go wander through the South Congress neighborhood and check that out. I wanna point out one other good place to grab food here as well, which is Veracruz All Natural. They've got a convenient little window on the side of the Line Hotel here. It's definitely one of the best little taco places in town, especially if you're looking for more authentic Mexican style tacos. Because to me, there's sort of a spectrum of tacos in Austin. You've got the more authentic Mexican style, and then you've got what I like to call hipster tacos. And those are really exemplified by places like Torchy's, which is a local. We've got Torchy's now even outside of Austin, and their tacos are also great, but they're a little less traditional to the Mexican style. But no matter what kind of tacos you like, and I do recommend if you come to Austin, you try a wide variety, but you'll find it all here. And now we are here on the Congress Avenue Bridge. We're just gonna make one more cross of this street before we wrap up, but I wanna make sure that y'all get a view of our beautiful lake/river. This is one thing that a lot of people ask about. Is the body of water in the middle of Austin a river or a lake? The answer is it's both. Like I mentioned before, it is a part of the Colorado River. Again, not the big Colorado River, the smaller Colorado River. And, but here, because it's dammed up, it also has formed a man-made lake. Debatable title itself. Now, historically, this lake was called Town Lake. You know, a good, simple name. But Lady Bird Johnson, that is, of course, former First Lady of Texas, like I mentioned much earlier on in the tour, she really was passionate about beautifying the city and the state. And one of her projects in the 1970s was to basically initiate a massive cleanup of the banks of the river, the lake here, and to turn it into a more beautiful destination, a place where locals could really come and enjoy themselves. And so after that, a lot of locals thought that they should rename the lake in honor of Lady Bird, call it Lady Bird Lake. But she was not a fan of that idea. She really wanted it to be Town Lake, as it has always been. But as soon as she passed away in 2007, it only took the city about a month to rename the lake after her, even against her own wishes. So these days, depending on who you ask, this is either Town Lake or Lady Bird Lake. But there are lots of ways that you can enjoy the lake. You'll see some swan boats out there, kayaks. It's a great place to catch a view of the bats. As y'all might know, we are known as the Bat City. And that's because underneath this bridge, the Congress Avenue Bridge, we have the largest urban bat colony in North America. They are a colony of Mexican free-tailed bats who migrate up here from Mexico every spring. They've just arrived over the course of the last month or so. And actually, the approximately 750,000 bats that we have under the bridge right now are pretty much all going to be mothers pretty soon. This is a maternal bat colony. So by the end of this summer, we'll have close to 1.5 million bats here in Austin, because each one of those mothers will have a cute little baby bat with her by that time. So over the course of the summer, and especially because it's later on in the summer, it's a very popular thing to do, to come around right at sunset and see the incredible swarm of bats head out on their nightly hunt over Lady Bird Lake. So I just wanted to wrap up here with this beautiful view for y'all. The sun is coming out in Austin, Texas. It is heating up, and I hope that you guys had a really great time today. So again, drop us in the comments, what is the one thing that you want to come and visit Austin? I'm very curious to hear, and I hope that y'all did have a great time today. Now, as you know, I am with Tipster. We are the first and only tip-based tour company in Austin. Again, I'm Laura, and I hope that you guys had as much fun as I did today. I know this was a new experience for me, a very different way of doing a tour, but I hope that you guys along for the ride had a great time. I know I did. And if you do want to show your appreciation, we've got our donation links in the description. Again, I do this because I love it. I want to show y'all a great time. But I want to make sure that you also get a chance to show your appreciation. So if you do want to do that, of course, totally up to you. Throw your donation in there, throw your comments in the chat as well. And if there are any last questions, I can go ahead and answer those. But otherwise, I will say farewell to y'all, but I'll hang out for another minute if you guys are hanging, if you have any questions for me to answer.
They're like 45 seconds, 30 to 45 seconds behind us. Anyway.
Oh, gotcha.
To catch it.
Totally.
And then when they text us, it'll take 2 seconds for it to show back up.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for any last questions, we're gonna spin our view one more time around this way and check out a really cool new mural that was just painted a few months ago here in town.
I'll let you get to watch as well when people are saying thank you,
Oh,
so
yeah.
you can see them coming in.
Thanks so much, y'all, for joining us. So much fun to get to hang out with you guys all over the world today.
Shannon says thanks, tour. We've got Ross, Ross and Nikki, who are both watching but not together. Thank you guys.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks,
Kristen.
Diana.
Diana, amazing, thank you.
And Michaela,
Mom,
thanks so much for your questions. Yeah, Mom, thanks for
Mom.
watching.
There's Nikki, thank you, Teague, really appreciate it. You guys know if you really, thank you, Michaela. If you guys want sharing the video, even as a video after it's done with the live, helps a lot to let Laura and Tipster reach more people, so that way when they're coming to Austin, they'll be able to come on this awesome tour. Where are you guys up and running again right now? I mean, can people come to Austin right now and join a tour with you?
Yeah, great question. So in the past year, we've been offering private tours only. They are just $15 a person, because it is still very important to us to make sure that they are affordable and accessible to and schedule a private tour with us, but we are hoping to get some public tours back up and running in the last of our spring season here. So check out our website, tipstertours.com.
We've got a link in the comments.
Oh yeah, we've got that link.
Actually, in the description of the video, there's a link underneath your name.
Great. You can also, of course, find us on Facebook and Instagram, but our website is where you'll find the schedule of tours, and where as soon as we've got those public tours up and running again, you'll see info on that. So typically we do offer a downtown tour that's a little bit of what we talked about today, a little bit different though too, so if you do come to town, you will definitely still get some different info, different stories out of that tour. But we also have a music tour, of course, being the live music capital of the world, and that's mostly about kind of the music history as well as the present of Austin. So you'll hear a lot more great stories of our music culture, music scene, different types of music, different places to go to listen to music. We also have a really fun East Side art tour. So over in the very hip neighborhood of East Austin, we'll find a lot more cool kinds, and that is constantly changing and growing as well. So a really cool place to see some of that very lively street art scene here in Austin. And then we also have a Haunts and Horrors tour. So if you are one of those ghost story fans and you want to hear a little bit more about the sinister side of Austin history, that's definitely the one for you.
What do you guys say? Should we try to get Laura to give us a ghost tour for our next live stream? Should we come back and do an evening Austin tour with some ghost action? If we don't get some comments saying ghost tour with Laura, you know, who knows what's going to happen, right?
I would love to do a ghost tour for you. There are a lot of great stories that we didn't get to today in terms of the ghostly side of Austin. And again, we kind of can pick apart some of the urban legends too, see what the real history is behind some of those ghost stories. And
Says yes to ghost tour.
yes, Shannon, I will see you on the ghost tour. But you know, there are also some great lesser known stories that haven't turned into. So even the ghosts that you'll hear about from most Austinites, they're leaving some of the good stuff out.
Says yes to the ghost tour. Ghost tour is the one.
All right, ghost tour is the way to go.
Now we
So
know what we're doing.
we will see y'all again soon for a ghost tour. But for now, we'll sign off. Say farewell to everyone. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you soon.
It's one of my few things that I'm gonna do, which I'm just gonna say goodbye as well, and then give you the honor, if you wouldn't mind, of stopping the live feed by pressing that end button.
All right, here we go.
there.
I'm sad to say goodbye to you, but we'll see you again
It's not
soon.
goodbye, it's just until soon.
Until
right?
later. Thanks, Chris, as well.
Loved it. So
Later,
good.
y'all.
God, you're such a pro. So much.